Remote aerodromes are the lifelines to Australia's isolated communities, but they impose demanding operational problems on pilots, managers and aerodrome operators. The challenges are many and varied: wildlife, extremes of weather, mainly unsealed airstrips and unforgiving terrain. Thousands of remote airstrips like this one dot Australia, from the dead centre to the coast. But where are they? It's quite remarkable if you think about it, but half of Australia is considered remote. This represents a huge area, about 4 million square kilometres. In this program, we're going to give you a taste of what it's like to fly in remote Australia. We'll meet some of the people who fly there and the communities they serve. We'll look at some of the operational problems facing pilots and aerodrome owners. We'll also get some good advice from those who know on how to stay safe and keep the vital air links open.
Need an aerodrome, especially during the wet season, to get our mail, which comes once a week, and also our freight.
Well, we get mail in here twice a week, and for our emergency services like the Flying Doctor, which we use quite often here.
A cyclone lashes the top end, its ferocity shutting down most operations across the region. Torrential rain makes many airstrips unusable. And even if they were open, rain and high winds would ground aircraft. While the big wet causes headaches, the dry poses its own problems. Dust in the air, whipped up by strong winds, cuts visibility and makes windsocks difficult to see. Erosion damages runways, and the dust on the ground can disguise potholes.
When it rains, it comes in such deluges that it just washes everything away. Or alternatively, when it dries out, it simply blows away. So you get all forms. You'll get wind-blown hollows, you'll get gutters and scours from rains, and then you get the added things like at the wet season, the ants will come along and they build the anthills everywhere, and they grow at a phenomenal rate, as do the natural vegetation. Once it rains, everything grows at a phenomenal rate. You wouldn't believe it, like feet in a couple of weeks.
To the outback aviator, unrestrained animals are a big danger. They can cause a serious accident if they wander across an aerodrome at the wrong time.
The biggest problems are dogs, camels and kids on the airstrip here in their motor cars, but yeah, mostly camels. Most pilots know to buzz the strip before they come in. The camels just pose a pretty big risk to a plane when it's landing mostly. Yeah, that's about it here. But with fences, they damage fences as well. They're very hard to keep out and very hard to keep in if you want to do that as well. They're just very hard on fences, yeah.
The main hazards are definitely cattle, general surface, especially during the wet season. A lot of the strips sort of get washed away. Ill-defined landing areas through lack of cones and no windsocks. They're sort of the general things.
Cattle on an airstrip is a big issue. Then you've got the added complication, not just the cattle, but the remnants of, if it is soft, they put hoof prints into the mud.
Aerodrome operators face an uphill battle keeping their facilities up to scratch. The Civil Aviation Safety Authority has guidelines covering aeroplane landing areas and standards for aerodromes. These include a minimum runway width of 10 metres and a minimum runway strip width of 30 metres. Dimensions vary according to the aircraft weight and whether the aerodrome is used for day or night operations. A longitudinal slope between the runway ends of not more than 2%, a transverse slope between the extreme ends of the runway strip of no more than 2.5%, and both ends of the runway approach and takeoff areas above a 5% slope should be clear of objects. An important consideration for safety is the provision of a runway strip on each side of the runway. The runway strip should be graded to a condition that ensures minimal damage to an aeroplane which might run off a runway during takeoff or landing, say following a tyre blowout or loss of directional control. Outside the runway strips there could be ungraded flyover areas. These should be free of tree stumps, large rocks or any other obstacles. Where extended operations are expected to be conducted at a landing area, the owner-operator should provide markings or markers similar to those found at licensed or certified aerodromes. Runway markers such as cones should be constructed of material unlikely to damage the aircraft.
As you approach the airfield, usually the first thing you're looking for is the wind direction indicator, and if there's a cleared area around the windsock, provides a bit of a contrast between the windsock and the background, and you can pick up the wind direction much easier. In addition to the cleared area around the windsock, you have not only the runway that needs to be cleared, but the runway strip. That gives us a bit of warning if there's livestock coming in. We can see them approaching. Also gives nice clean airflow around the airstrip to reduce the wind shear. And the clear actual runway strip, so that you can identify things like anthills and anything that may have blown onto the strip or been left behind by passing stock.
For the aerodrome operators, maintaining their strips is a very substantial and year-round challenge and is particularly difficult in the wet season. It takes lots of good old Aussie bush engineering to keep the strips operational.
So I've got a bulldozer and I've got a blade on the back of the tractor and a tyre drag made out of big scraper tyres.
Cutting grass mainly, like, you know, in the wet, in the dry, just do a bit of patch up and all that. But in the runway, or takeoff, that's where we have most of the problem, right? Like, you know, they stand there and just revving the engine, you know, just blow all the sand out. Day in, day out, we always try to fill it back in again, try to, you know, grow some grass.
Commercial air operators face an ongoing battle to balance financial viability against the need to provide the highest possible level of safety. In remote regions, the difficulties are greater. The keys to success include proper planning and communication, as well as forging close links to aerodrome operators and customers. Since it was established in 1928, the Royal Flying Doctor Service has learnt a thing or two about outback aviation and sets the standard for safety and efficiency. In its life-saving Mercy dashes into remote regions, the RFDS also has to protect its pilots and medical staff.
If you're doing something very unusual, like for example out of our Mount Isa base, and you're called to a black soil strip in the middle of the night, thunderstorms around, been a cyclone in the wet season, there are particular risks that you must not only identify, but you have to defeat those risks. The other risk, which is a more insidious risk, is the risk that's involved with apathy. That is, same old, same old. We're doing the same thing day after day. This is routine, like driving to work, but people have accidents driving to work. So you have to have a constant process of being curious about just what it is that you're doing and continually looking under the bushes for risk. It's nighttime operations produces for all of us a particular set of challenges. Many of the visual cues that we rely on during the daytime are just not present, and the risk of controlled flight into terrain, the classic Seaford accident, is certainly enhanced by night as opposed to day operations. So again, we apply the same principle. We train and overtrain, we check and overcheck for night operations. We occasionally land to flares, occasionally we have the requirement for Mercy flights to land onto car headlights. So we produce the rules, the protocols to all the constituents about how you set up the cars, how you set up the wind indications and how you operate. And we formally train our pilots and we formally check them into those sorts of places.
Good preparation and planning are vitally important for safety in all forms of flying, but even more so in remote areas where the potential hazards are many and the conditions often extreme. Pilots need an intimate knowledge of their operating environment, and they need to be in close communication with aerodrome operators, other pilots and the Weather Bureau. Proper planning starts on the ground and continues throughout the flight, including the landing phase, where pilots must be especially alert.
Definitely when landing at these strips you should do a precautionary search. When you're doing it you should always be aware that there are going to be trees on the side of the runway, maybe up to 50 feet high, as well as the windsock pole. When doing the search, things you're looking for are tracks on the strip. It's obviously the weather that affects the strips the most out here, and the owner might have come out and run up and down the strip with his car. You'll be able to tell where it's most damp by the tracks. You're also looking for things like cattle movement. A lot of these strips aren't fenced, and there's often cattle hidden off into the bushes. They might get startled by your flyby and then come out as you're coming into land. So when you're doing the flyby, it's always worth keeping an eye on both sides of the strip, but especially where you're going to land. The strip themselves often get soggy at both ends, so when you come into land and you have to turn around, it's always a smart idea to have more RPM on than usual. That way you won't get bogged.
Out here, pilots and airstrip owners and operators need to stay in touch for updates on weather and the condition of the strips.
Yeah, morning Gareth. How are you, mate? Yeah, look, it's a bit wet here at the moment. You're due in about 10 o'clock. If you could leave it to at least midday, give it a chance to get a bit of sun on it. We had 38 mil of rain last night.
The Mission Aviation Fellowship is another organisation with vast experience of operating in remote areas, not just in Australia, but all over the world.
Preparation and planning is a big thing. Know where you're going, know what the conditions of the airstrips are, try and get that sort of information as best you can. Have fuel reserves to go somewhere else if need be, if you get over the top and find that the aerodrome is unserviceable. Be trained to be able to go into short airstrips. Flying around Bankstown's fine, but also needing to get training into going into and out of gravel airstrips, and especially short airstrips, and being able to fly the aircraft to its performance limits.
And operators need to choose the appropriate aircraft for the job. The Royal Flying Doctor Service echoes these views. The service's long history in the outback has generated a formidable corporate knowledge of air operations in remote areas, and this has created an operational philosophy based on 3 guiding principles.
You must have a very, very good corporate knowledge to all the destinations that you wish to operate, and that is the physical dimensions of length and width and approach and departure displays, its lighting facilities, and particularly the surface conditions. And you have to be proactive in keeping that knowledge current. You must check with aerodrome operators, you must check with property owners. If anything changes, you're told about it. You must use all the means available to you to keep your knowledge up to date. Satellite phones, UHF, whatever. And before you operate into a rural and remote aerodrome or an airstrip or any sort of facility, you must go out and gather all the information that's possibly available to you on the destination. That's really important. The second basic principle, and we operate to hundreds of different destinations, varying from a sophisticated facility like here in Brisbane to very primitive airfields at pastoral holdings and remote Aboriginal communities and mining sites. You must have a rigid check and training system. You must have absolute quality assurance that your pilots are capable of going into these places. They understand the risks, and you must practice, practice, practice. You must overtrain and you must overcheck. And the third element is that one should absolutely encourage all your constituents, those people who are providing facilities, to strive for excellence in providing the best possible facility they can for safety. They're the 3 points that we would come back to every time.
Operators cram vital information into airfield directories, precious resources for both existing and new pilots. Even seemingly trivial data could one day save a pilot's life.
We have the equivalent, an internal document called our airfield directory, and that gives all the information about the physical characteristics of the destination, but a lot more. Any specific requirements, should you lose an engine after takeoff, the escape routes, any particular peculiarities about a destination, high ground in the obstacles in the circling area, escape routes, what's written on the roof of the house, what the UHF frequency is, what the telephone number is, what the best alternate is, the next property, whether you can use it after so many points of rain. All that sort of information has to be gathered, but more importantly, it has to be kept up to date.
So there you have it, a brief look at what it's like to fly in remote Australia. Difficult, demanding and unpredictable, but for many pilots highly satisfying and the best flying experience of their lives. If you're operating a bush aerodrome, upkeep, markings and good communication are critical. For pilots, remote area operations are in many ways a world of their own. But the fundamentals apply, no matter what kind of flying we're talking about. Preparation, planning, training, honing skills and setting high standards.